A dangerous predator capable of sinking to the depths of depravity. That's how a High Court judge once summed up the notorious Scottish serial killer, rapist and paedophile Angus Sinclair, who's died in prison at the age of 73 from natural causes. Throughout his life, he was convicted of 4 killings, including the World's End murders. But detectives suspected he was responsible for several more. Angus Sinclair was 16 years old when he was convicted of killing for the first time after raping and strangling 7-year-old Catherine Reel. He was released from prison in 1968 but was taken off the streets for good in 1982 after he confessed to raping and sexually assaulting 11 girls in Glasgow aged between 3 and 14. In 2001, Sinclair was convicted of 17-year-old Mary Gallagher's murder. In 2004, the World's End inquiry found DNA evidence linking Sinclair to the 1977 killings of 17-year-olds Helen Scott and Christine Eadie. In 2014, Sinclair was convicted of their murders under a double jeopardy retrial and received a 37-year sentence. The World's End inquiry also linked Sinclair to the killings of Agnes Cooney, Hilda Macaulay and Anna Kenny in Glasgow between 1977 and 1978. But these cases remain unsolved. We assessed the crimes of Angus Sinclair with the former Deputy Chief Constable Tom Wood, who led the 2004 police investigation into the World's End murders. Tom Wood, how would you describe Angus Sinclair?
Angus Sinclair was probably one of the most dangerous men to disgrace the face of Scotland in the last 100 years. He spent 47 years in prison, and he was only at liberty for 12 years as an adult, and yet in that time he was convicted of murdering 4 women. He raped and abused another 10 children, and we suspect that he murdered another 3 women. So by any measure, he rates amongst the most dangerous men who we've ever had the misfortune to have in Scotland. In your role investigating him, you did meet him. What sort of man was he? Well, when we met him in 2004, he was a small, thin, grey-haired man that you would have passed in the street and never taken a second look at. When you meet these people and you know what their backgrounds are, you expect somehow to be meeting somebody extraordinary. You expect somehow to be able to tell from their demeanour or their appearance what kind of person they are. It's not true. Angus Sinclair, when we met him in 2004, was a nonentity. Was he fundamentally evil, do you think? I think he had strong sociopathic tendencies. He had no empathy for any of his victims. He never accepted any blame or guilt, never showed an ounce of contrition. And even when he broke his silence and gave evidence on his own behalf at his trial in 2013, it's very clear that he saw women as objects to be used and discarded. Is there any way, given his history of crime, particularly when he started as a young man, is there any way he could have been stopped sooner, do you think? Well, I think he could have been. I think that when you look at the judge's remarks and the psychiatrist's report, when he was first convicted in 1960 as a 15-year-old, I think had more attention been paid to what the judge and the psychiatrist said, then I think probably we might have prevented some of these killings later on. They made it quite clear that their view was that he was a highly dangerous man who would always present a danger to the public. And yet he went into the adult prison system, showed absolutely no signs of any kind of contrition or any willingness to accept his guilt or any attempt to rehabilitate himself. He went into the system, he worked the system, and he popped out as a more dangerous and a more hardened man than he went in. So lessons can be learned from that, do you think? I think we've got to try to learn some positive lessons from the disgraceful life of Angus Sinclair. First of all, I think we should remember his victims. we shouldn't lionize him or make him into some kind of anti-hero. We should remember the awful toll he took of women in Scotland in the 1970s, young women and children together. We should remember that, and we should try hard to look at the example of his case and try to learn lessons for the future, because we still have young men, very young men, who are convicted of serious sexual offences in their teenage years. They represent a very, very extreme danger, and we've got to make sure that when they are in the prison system or in the detention system, that they are successfully rehabilitated and not just spat out the other end, as Sinclair was, an even more dangerous and violent man.
Is it possible there were more victims?
He was convicted of the murder of 4 girls and young women, and the rape and sexual assault of 10 more children. I'm sure that he murdered at least 3 more women in Glasgow, possibly another one, possibly 4, and that's the ones that we know about. He undoubtedly took many secrets to his grave, and that's the one regret I have about his death, is that there was very little chance of any kind of deathbed confession from someone as hard-boiled as Angus Sinclair, but now there's no chance at all.
And what made him that hard-boiled, do you think? You've spoken about, was there anything in his childhood that pointed to him moving that way?
Not really. We investigated his childhood thoroughly. He was brought up in a decent, hard-working home, but it's fair to say that in the culture of the part of Glasgow he was brought up in that period of time, we're talking about 1950, 1951, it was an area where violence was normalised. And so undoubtedly, when he was a young boy, he will have experienced and been exposed to fairly extreme violence. And in that, he was in common with other killers that we had in Scotland at that time, Robert Black and Peter Tobin. They were all brought up about the same time in roughly the same fairly rough kind of areas where, as I say, violence was normalised.
You, of course, helped investigate later the World's End murder trial. That's the one that's possibly most associated with Angus Sinclair. What was it like working in that investigation, the murder of 2 young women?
Well, of course, I was one of hundreds of officers who worked on that for nearly 40 years, and it's important to say that. It was a generational investigation. There were hundreds of people talk about the great detective theory. Let me tell you that that's a myth. There was no great detective. There were dozens of great detectives and officers who worked on the World's End. And it became a way of life. It was our duty and responsibility here in Lothian Borders to solve these murders. And we were very fortunate in that one of our scenes of crimes officers who was at the scene of the deposition of the 2 girls here in Edinburgh was an incredible man who was very fastidious about the way he lifted, secured and retained the evidence. And years later, over 30 years later, when forensic science has moved on, we were able to take benefit from that. And that is what eventually convicted Angus Sinclair.
Briefly and finally, it's difficult, as you say, to mourn a man like Angus Sinclair. He was a serial killer. Given scientific advances in crime detection, the likelihood of a serial killer, another Angus Sinclair, do you think that it's unlikely, it's limited?
I think the risk is less because of systems they have now, and here in Scotland we now have a very, very good very good major inquiry team and major inquiry system. I think it's unlikely, but it's not impossible.
Tom Wood, thank you very much for sharing that with us in Scotland Tonight.
Thank you.